on. Hey, Anomalies. It is Tasha, one third of the Anomalous Black Women. And unfortunately, my co-host, Vina, is under the weather and Dr. Tanya had other obligations today. But I am grateful to have Dr. Sharice Jones Branch here with me today. She is the Dean of Graduate Studies, History.
Well, Dean of the Graduate School and Professor of History.
And Professor of History. Okay. Let me make sure I get that correct. All right. So, Dean of Graduate Studies and Professor of History at Arkansas State University. She is also the author of Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas, 1914 to 1965. She is also a veteran, just like myself and my lovely co-host. And she is also a sorority sister of Dr. Tanya's, the Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. The lovely Lady Poos. I love it. I love it. I love it. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us. And I just want to get right into it. Let's start with the academic side of who you are. Tell me a little bit of how you got into the world of academics. It's not for everybody.
It is not. And as I always tell people, when I was a kid, I grew up in a house filled with books. My mom is a retired science teacher. My late father was an electrical engineer. And they bought us Encyclopedia Britannica and the Ebony Encyclopedia of Black History. And I read them both. And I started looking at both of them and thinking, I don't really see Black people showing up in a prominent way in Encyclopedia Britannica, but I saw that in the Ebony Black History books. And I was just enthralled, and I was intrigued, because one of the things in my mind was always, what aren't we being told, and why aren't we being told those stories? Whose history are we being told, and why?
Right.
I always wondered about that, and I knew from the time that I was very, very young that I wanted to become a historian, which was interesting because, again, my parents come from scientific backgrounds. So when I went to college, I at first thought, I wanted to go to law school. I thought I wanted to major in political science. I found out very quickly that didn't really interest me, but history always did. History always interested me. And so I went to college, not my first year, but my second year. I had pretty well made up my mind that I was going to major in history. And I always like to tell people that I spent 1 year at an HBCU. I went to South Carolina State University for my freshman year, but I was also in the Army Reserve at the time. And of course, when I started my second year at South Carolina State University, that's when my unit was mobilized and sent overseas to the Persian Gulf.
Okay. All right. So in all of your studies and all of your reading, is there a person who you connect with or find yourself connecting with more than others?
I write about Black women, and it's very hard not to find something in common with these Black women. But I always tell people about one woman, because all of the women I wrote about in my book, with the exception of one, had been dead for decades. They transitioned to the ancestors decades ago. But there was one woman, her name is Annie Zachary Pike, and she's from Marble, Arkansas. And I actually got to interview her. This is a Black woman, rural Arkansas, who owns a substantial amount of land that she got from her husband. And in the 60s, she was very much involved in the community. She had run for public office as a Republican, which for many Black people, was the Progressive Party in the early 1970s. And when I met her, it was like I had met a long lost relative. We clicked instantly. We found out that we had several things in common almost immediately. We were in some of the same organizations, and she had led a fascinating life, which no one had ever bothered to write about. And so that resonated with me because there's so many fascinating stories out there about all the wonderful things that Black women have done, but nobody thought they were important. And in truth, some of these Black women didn't think what they did was that important, because in their minds it was just what they did.
Right.
But I said, no, this is an absolutely phenomenal story, and I am blessed to be able to interview you and talk to you and sit in your house in Marble, Arkansas, and look through all these archival materials that she had saved, because that was the other thing. Often the women who've done these fascinating things, we won't know their names. We won't know, we won't have any sort of tangible evidence of any of the things that they've done, because they won't be in the traditional archives. So I always tell people that this was such a wonderful experience for me, because I had to hone a different set of skills as a historian, but it wasn't hard to do because I had the cultural capital. I knew how to approach this older Black woman in order to get to know her, to become friends with her, and to then have her tell me her story. She could trust me. She knew I wasn't going to grab the story and run. So I had to pivot, but it wasn't a difficult pivot. I already had the skills just by virtue of the fact that I had lived my life as a Black woman. So there were things that I understood that I did not have to explain, or I didn't have to have them explained to me.
So that is fascinating, and that leads us to to your book. We're right into it. Nice little segue that we had there. So that inspiration to was it first, I'm inspired by you, I should write a book? Or was it first, I want to write a book, this inspires me, and this is what I'm going to write about?
I was really inspired by, I wanted to write this book, and it didn't start as a book, it started as a conference paper. I didn't think it was going to go any further than it did. And where it started was somebody writing about home demonstration agents who were employed by the Arkansas Agricultural Extension Service. And I said, well, what about Black agents? And what I was told was, oh, they do the same thing. And I said, I don't believe that. I don't accept that. This is the rural Jim Crow South. Nothing about their experience in this profession would be the same as other people's experience. So at first I was challenged by that. And then I said, okay, I'll just write a conference paper about this. And then that would be that. And then it just started to take on this life of its own. I really began to see and understand that rural women did things, Black, white, pink, or purple spots, but we hadn't been hearing about rural Black women. I mean, we hear about them as agricultural laborers, but I said, no, their lives are far more complex than that, and rurality is not ignorant. Just because you pick cotton during the day does not mean that you're ignorant. And so what I discovered very quickly was there are Black women who might pick cotton 12 hours a day, but then they're presidents of the Home Demonstration Club at night. And not every rural Black woman was an agricultural laborer. Some of them owned land. Some of them were Gene's industrial supervising teachers. Some of them were members of the Arkansas Association of Colored Women. More than a few of them were educated. All of them worked to make sure the next generation received an education. So I just knew immediately that we have to absolutely complicate this story, and no one else has done it.
And it, considering the current climate right now with the various strikes going on, it just made me think, like, you rarely see our faces when we're talking about, that specific space of activism and fighting for the things that are due us and rightfully so. So it just, I don't know, I just took a minute, like, how many times do I ever see a Black woman in those types of conversations?
But here's the thing, they're always there.
Yeah.
It just a lot of it is what people decide to focus on and who they decide to focus on.
Right.
I mean, they aren't there. It just means people choose not to see them, which is a very different sort of thing.
It is. It absolutely is. In a whole nother episode, right?
Another episode. I mean, even when I talk about rural Black women, there were. I mean, of course, there were people like Fannie Lou Hamer from Mississippi. Of course, there were a very few well-known examples, but in the norm, no, and surely not in Arkansas. And so, what was intriguing for me was there are all these books on rural women, but virtually none on rural Black women and what they were doing. And when you tell me they were doing the same thing, I'm just like, look, I don't live in Missouri, but I live close. You're going to have to show me.
Right.
And so in writing this book, I did have to use more than a few examples of histories of rural white women. I know most of the scholars who write rural white women history. We're friends. We've been on panels together, both nationally and internationally. So what I was able to do is lift some of the frameworks that they use to tell those women's stories and make it fit for rural Black women in Arkansas and in the South generally. And so that's what I was able to do, is just really do a deep dive into what Black women were doing in these spaces. And as I tell people all the time, they weren't all picking cotton.
Right.
They were not all picking cotton.
So I imagine that you did a bit of traveling in your preparation for this book. Was it just bottom part of like, I'm not familiar with Arkansas, so I mean, was it the whole state that we were talking to people, or was it just one area that, you know?
It was largely the Delta, which is where I live, because that's where the largest Black population is in this state. And the Black population in Arkansas is only about 13 or 14%, but most of that is in the Arkansas Delta. And most of it actually is south of where I live in Jonesboro. For the further south you go in Arkansas, the blacker it gets, I'd like to tell people. But I didn't have to travel all over the state necessarily. I just had to get my hands on the resources and find Black women in those resources. So I went to places like the Butler Center in Little Rock. I got resources from the archive, special collections at the University of Arkansas. But the thing about these women, especially the ones who were really well-known leaders in their communities and in their spheres of influence, they had connections to people and things outside of the state.
Okay.
Some of these women had national connections. And all of this had been lost. And so it was a matter of looking at traditional archives, non-traditional archives. I spent an awful lot of time looking at digitized newspapers. I'm so thankful they've all been digitized, because I didn't even have to move up from behind my desk to do that.
Right.
but it wasn't just reading the newspapers. It was reading them very, very carefully and looking for clues, which often were obvious, but sometimes not. It was being mindful of things like, for example, if I'm looking for a Black woman who was a jeans teacher in Mississippi County, Arkansas, jeans is spelled Geanes. Well, I had to look and see if it was spelled Geenes or something like that. So it was really that sort of fine, that granular work that I had to do to tell these women's stories. And that, quite frankly, is what it requires. Because there's not, like I said, there's not just an archives or a book that I could model my book off of on rural Black women's activism. That's just out there. I had to build it.
So I guess this could be a bit of that answer, but what were some other roadblocks and hurdles along the way? And how did you overcome those things, getting to the end of your book and publishing it?
Probably the biggest obstacle was time.
Mm-hmm.
It was going to happen. That's just all there was to that. I made up my mind about that. This book was too important to not be in the world. I don't think there were really any other obstacles because I could get the resources I needed. And a lot of times it was just about somebody knowing somebody. For
Right.
example, there were resources I needed from Special Collections at the University of Arkansas. Well, that's about a 5-hour drive from where I am right now. And so I have such a good relationship with folks in Special Collections there that
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually have to go to Fayetteville to get those resources. They sent them to me. They sent them to Jonesboro.
Nice.
Yeah, there were things that I needed at the University of Central Arkansas, which is about 2 hours from there. I went to look in their archives. I got those things and things that I discovered later by looking online. They sent them to me. And as I said, digitized newspapers and other digitized resources, like, for example, women who were involved with the NAACP, and most of these women were, well, the NAACP papers are digitized. They're in the Arkansas State University Library database.
Nice.
Right. So technology has really revolutionized the way we can do research.
Yeah. And it's only getting more.
It's getting better. It's getting
Yes.
better all the time. Because when I wrote my first book, when I published my first book, I had to travel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and what does that mean? You got to carve out the time. You got to secure funding. You got to make sure the archives are open and
Right.
that they have what you have. And you have to hope that what they have is voluminous so that you haven't traveled hundreds of miles to find that they've got one sheet of paper.
Right. And that's what I came all the way here for.
Yeah. So, but I was dedicated to writing this book, and I was like, I am going to tell these women's stories. I'm going to tell these stories. I'm going to make sure people see them. And in the case of people like Annie Zachary Pike, who's the last chapter of this book, I said, no, you're going to get your roses right now.
Yes.
Yeah, right now.
So this was 19. So give us the title of the first book.
Oh Lord, let me see if I can remember. It's crossing the lines: Black and white women's activism in South Carolina during after World War II, and that book was. South Carolina is my home state. I'm a native of Charleston, South Carolina. I'm not a native Arkansan, and that book actually came from my dissertation.
Okay.
And again, it was another story where I thought we're not hearing the stories of regular everyday women and white women, by the way, in civil rights activism in South Carolina, or racial activism, I should say, because that's a different sort of thing. And so it was my dissertation, and I was like, no, this is gonna be my first book because these women's stories need to be told as well.
Yep. All right. So this is what, 2023? So what inspires you to keep going? And is there, I feel like there is, there's got to be another book in the works. I feel like it is.
There is. There is.
All right.
What inspires me to keep going is I love the work. I love the work. I love looking at old newspapers and through documents and really finding out who people were so that we understand that we're not as new and as special as we think we are. We are not. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be giving a talk, like I said, in about a week about African American activism in Arkansas in the early 20th century. And I'm going to be giving this talk to a bunch of medical students here at we have a medical school at Arkansas State. And really, it's to impress upon them that when you go and work in these communities, you are not new. You are just the most recent iteration, and that is it. Don't think that these people were sitting around just suffering from poor health and this is just what they wanted to do. No, that activism has always been there.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think it's always been there. So those kind of things really inspire me. And there are just so many stories to tell. And just so I always like to make it clear to people, I'm an agricultural rural historian. I really, really like that work. And when it comes to agricultural history, I'm really interested in the cultural part of that because people are more than their agricultural production. They are more than crops. They are more than that. How do they
Mm-hmm.
make and sustain communities, especially among African Americans? Because contrary to popular belief, not every African American went traipsing off to the north.
Right.
A lot of those
And
people chose to stay.
to stay.
Mhm.
And right now, ooh, especially after this heat that we just endured, and I guess we're still enduring it.
Not here.
um,
It's lovely here today.
it's not. It's lovely. Well, yeah, it's low. I think it's like upper 60s, low 70s,
Same here.
probably. Okay, so but you know, a lot of our agriculturists are had a rough summer, and
Right.
it's unfortunate, but I didn't realize, honestly. I mean, there has also been a shift from, I guess we went away from it, and then we're kind of moving back toward more farming, growing our own things, which we shouldn't have never stopped doing.
Right. Right.
For more reasons.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, a few months ago, I did a thing on a program with oh God, I'm forgetting her name right now. O'Brien. You know, O'Brien. What's her first name? Black woman.
Soledad?
Soledad. Yeah, on a show that she hosts. I wasn't interviewed by her. It was
Okay.
a show that she hosts.
Uh-huh.
We were talking about black farmers, agriculture, and I filmed this in Washington D.C. But we were in a community garden, and one of the things that we talked about was that we didn't really lose it. It shifted, right? Because when a lot of these people moved to urban spaces, the first thing they did was create gardens.
Yeah.
They created gardens. So I don't think of it as a loss as much of a shift, but the shift did cost something, right? Because you're right. I mean, subsequent generations didn't value gardens and agriculture. The subsequent generation, like the folks in my generation, my parents were not my parents, but people of their generation from the Low Country of South Carolina, they all went to New York, right? And they would send their kids back down to South Carolina in the summertime. Well, they just thought we were just some country bumpkins because we had gardens, right? And just so we're clear, I didn't grow up in a rural area. My mother did. I visited a rural area all the time, but I grew up in the suburbs. But we always had a garden. My mother still has a garden. And, my cousins from New York City thought that was the countryest thing. But, when I look back on that now, I think to myself, yeah, but you live in a food desert. Vegetables were never hard for me to access.
Right.
I was growing up. So we never lost that. I think it just took on a different form. But you are correct in that there are people moving back to the land. There are black people, black women who are homesteading, and it's in their DNA because it's before the generation of folks who migrated away from the South. That's what we did, but that's also what we continue to do because, as I said, everybody didn't leave.
Yeah.
Everybody didn't leave the South.
No. I wish I could remember what I was watching, but the story also incorporated. They were talking about. I guess it might have been here in Texas. There's a community where it started off with just 2 or 3 parents who, during the COVID, were like, add to it all of the school violence. We don't want to send our kids to school anymore. And so they created their own homeschooling unit, which has grown. They have like 44 kids now. And, it's untraditional, but it's traditional because they're teaching them not only the things that they wanted to keep from them by not allowing them, access to certain books and stuff. If you don't want me to see what's in it, I want to see what's in it. And so that's the things that they are, bringing to those kids, by being able to control the information. In Texas, we don't really have the same, I guess, strict guidelines when it comes to curriculum. Mm-hmm. And so they're pretty much free to incorporate what they want to incorporate into their school curriculum. And so these kids are having an opportunity to learn their history, learn the other history, travel and see field trips that are meaningful to them,
Right.
And so gardening is a part of their curriculum, and
Absolutely.
It's just beautiful, Yeah. It's beautiful.
It is beautiful. And it also has some significant emotional, psychological, and physical benefits, right? Because as you said, you're seeing the history, you're being taught a history that centers you and people who are like you. You're also in an environment where people understand who you are as a Black child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And everybody's not going to get that. Everybody's not going to understand that. And the field trips matter as well, right? Because to me, like a child growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, I was taken on field trips. The school took us on field trips to plantations.
Right.
Without ever talking about the enslaved folks.
Right.
Like, I don't care about how pretty the building is. I want to know about the people who constructed it.
Mm-hmm.
And the lives they lived in that space. Who were those people, right? Mm-hmm. But nobody was talking about that back then. And so, like I said, even as a kid, without really even having a knowledge for it, that was one of the things that made me want to become a history. But to your question about, is there another book? I am working on another book on, I'm very interested in the Farm Bureau. I'm interested in the Farm Bureau. So my next book is going to be on African American farmers and the Farm Bureau, because again, when you see the Farm Bureau, you rarely, if ever, see Black farmers as members. They were members. They are members. But up until the 1960s, virtually all Southern Farm Bureaus were segregated.
Believe that.
Yeah, they were segregated, and the Farm Bureau is largely a conservative organization. So I'm very curious about how African Americans interpreted that, right? Because you're farming in the rural South, where for many, certainly not all, but many Black people, that's a dangerous proposition. So how are you navigating?
How are you navigating that?
Yeah. How are you navigating all of that? So I'm very much intrigued by that. In fact, I have the manuscript printed out on my conference table in my office. I haven't looked at it in a few months, but I think I needed to do that. I need to come back to it with fresh eyes. And and I'm always thinking about what the next project is. I would love to do an edited collection, for instance, on rural Black women, and not just in the South, by the way. In the South, Black people lived in other rural spaces in the country.
Yes,
like North Dakota.
Right. Much to my shock, really?
But we do reside in other spaces, and so those histories are important to me as well. So even though I'm an administrator and I'm going to continue being an administrator, I'm going to continue to publish. It might take a little longer. The pace might be a bit slower, but I'm still going to do it.
Awesome. I look forward to that, and I'm going to have to get my hands on this book, because just the latest story that you shared is, it's things we need to know, things we need to know.
Absolutely.
And everybody's story has the ability to impact you in some way, shape, form, or another. You should, gain something from someone's story.
I agree.
So what advice would you give to an aspiring author?
To write even when you're afraid to. Believe you have something to say. Know you have something to say, and that is meaningful. Tell the stories that are in you.
Right.
Somebody needs to hear them. And especially if you're writing as a historian, like I am, there are people who need to hear those stories. There are people who need to see themselves and understand themselves better by seeing them in the pages of my book or in the pages of one of my colleagues' books, right? Because there are people here in rural Arkansas who never knew how wonderful and powerful these women were in their communities. A previous generation knew that, but the folks who are younger than me, they don't know that. They think of a rural space as someplace to escape from, for reasons I understand. But I also want people to understand that at one point in time, these were dynamic and robust spaces with people who were doing some really important things.
Right. Yeah, I agree, definitely. And so just to that, you can't be an author if you don't write. So you need to just write, right?
Right, and write through the fear. And I say this only because I still deal with all of this, and I've written quite a bit. I still deal with all of this. I look at the computer and I think, I don't have anything to say.
But you do.
But I do, and I try very hard not to think of the project in its entirety. I think write 200 words, because if I think I got to write 200,000, I'm not writing anything. I can handle 200 words. I can handle 200 words, and just remind yourself that it adds up faster than you realize. But you got to do your own psychological work. You got to get over yourself. And I tell people, novice writer, experienced writer, whatever, we all go through it. We all go through it. I don't sit there and pretend like I don't go through it. I go through it all the time. I just tell the truth and shame the devil.
Oh my goodness, that's me with blogging. Like, I have long breaks, and I really shouldn't, because I'm always thinking about something. So maybe a better option for me sometimes is just to record myself talking versus trying to get a space to actually write it down, because it's still coming from the same place.
It's still coming from the same place, and I think about writing differently from when I was in graduate school. When I was in graduate school working on my dissertation, they told us to treat it like a job, and you would literally be sitting there writing or trying to write from 8 to 5. Well, that's not the reality of my life these days.
Right.
I might have an hour, but I'm going to take full advantage of that hour. And of course, I can't sit still but so long, so that hour is all I'm going to have anyway. Before I have to get up and do something else.
Ooh, butterfly.
But, ooh, dogs in the yard.
I understand that. That is absolutely me, and it's hilarious.
Like, ooh, I need to wash those clothes now. Clothes for a week.
Closing them.
Oh, that just don't even. We can't even talk about that.
So what? So we got our next book coming, and then talk to me about the two. I know it's two, but your upcoming events, because I think we're gonna run them for you as well this week.
Well, the most recent thing that I've got coming up, and it's the Jonesboro Women's Leadership Summit, and I will be one of 4 speakers for that at a panel that's going to start at 10 o'clock. And a lot of that's going to have to do with women's economic empowerment and what do women need to close the wage gap. And a lot of that has to do with my experience on the Arkansas Governor's Commission on Women. I was on that commission in 2022. I was appointed by the governor, the former governor, Asa Hutchinson, to that committee. And that was really, really special work, because the last time they had that committee was about 50 years ago.
Okay.
50. 50 years.
50. That was before I was thought about.
Not before I was thought about, but 50. And so I'm really proud of that work because
proud of that work.
Yeah. I was around the table with some really smart and powerful women and one man actually who ended up being the new chancellor of my institution. And
Wow.
yeah, and we actually co-chaired the research and writing committee on
Okay.
that commission. But what we discovered was that while there was some change, a lot hasn't changed. There's still work to be done. There's still a lot of work to be done, which none of that was surprising to me, right? But I think many, many, many people were not aware that we haven't gotten as far as we thought.
I could go somewhere with that, but I am not.
Okay.
I'm going to behave myself. I am going to behave myself. So, we know that you are an author and several times, and that you speak on your books and have discussions. And I want to tell the people how to contact you. If they'd like to have you as a guest, if they want to interview you, if they want to get a hold of your works, please share your contact information.
My email address is crjones@astate.edu. Just look up the graduate school and you'll see my face, Dean of the Graduate School. Or you can reach out to me on Facebook, Instagram. I do a little bit of the social media thing, and I'm happy to come in and talk to people. And sometimes it's not even about my scholarship. It's about things like, what is it like being a Black woman administrator at a predominantly white institution?
Right.
There's that. And so I always tell people I'm happy to talk to folks, especially groups of younger people, women, Black women, because I never, ever, ever imagined I'd be sitting in this position. Never, ever. I didn't know. I really didn't know. And I'm very transparent about that. There was nothing in my mind that ever told me I would end up where I am.
So just so I know, where did you think you would end up?
I thought at the very least I would end up being a university professor, which I did, and I had no idea what all that involved, right? I thought, okay, I'll write a few books, I'll teach for 30 years, then I'll go sit down and retire someplace. And then the opportunity to become an administrator happened. And I said, okay, I'll apply for that. And I got it. And then I've been in some leadership institutes, and I've done an American Council on Education fellowship. And now I'm like, okay, I see what upper administration is like in higher education, and I can completely do it.
Right.
I can absolutely do it. I don't have to know everything. I thought I did. I thought I had to know everything before I could do any of this. I thought I had to, I don't know, I thought I had to know everything. And that's just not true. You don't have to know everything. It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to constantly be learning. It's okay to reach out. It's okay to delegate. I didn't know any of that. Nobody told me.
I think we have a tendency to want to take everything on. It's in our nature. Just a little bit.
You're going to have to denaturalize that because it's killing us.
Mm-hmm.
And as a Black woman administrator, I am constantly thinking about the interim president of Temple University who died within the past few weeks.
Right.
And then the 56-year-old president of Volunteer State Community College who died a few days later.
Yeah, we have to do better.
We have to do better. I have.
But we were talking about that last piece of what you have going on, and I know the new book the farm bureau.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious. I am really curious to know where that leads you, because, and then where that book leads you, because I know that's not the last one. So I'm really, really curious where, the insights from that book will take you in your writings, because I'm pretty sure there are a lot of other places that our faces were a part of that no one knows about.
Absolutely.
I actually, I would love for all of the D9 sororities to do their documentaries. Mm-hmm. And the reason being is because so many of their members have been a part of a lot of different dynamic spaces.
Right.
That a lot of us don't know about, we see the colors, we see the presence in the communities locally, but not a lot of us know and understand the impact that these organizations have had globally,
right,
and politically. And I would love for all of the organizations in the D9 to, we don't want to know y'all secrets. We want to know y'all people.
No, we don't want to know the secrets. But yes, it's sort of like being a Mason, an Order of Eastern Star, to be one, ask one.
Yeah, I lived with one.
I am an OES, so
my dad is an interesting character. Yeah. He's an interesting character on Pathfinder, and he's also a retired Marine, so he's an interesting character all around.
Okay.
He's different.
And I think sometimes people who have been in the military, are different. Because I remember when I came back from the Persian Gulf, and Lord, this has been 32 years now. I was 20, 21 years old, and the things that concern 20 young people that age, I guess they concerned me, but it was different because of what I had just been through. Yeah,
absolutely.
And I even tell people, I said, there are things that I experienced 32 years ago that it took me 32 years to process because I was so young at the time. I thought I was grown. And I was like, no, you were of legal age, but you were not grown.
That's, what? That is a lot. That was a mouthful right there.
Yeah.
The things that you experienced then, it has taken you this long to really process it. And that's so true for a lot of things.
Right. For a lot of things. And perhaps that's just God's way of protecting you.
Yeah.
I think for me personally, I can't speak for anyone else, but I think God must have understood that you didn't have the maturity and the presence of mind to be able to process the enormity of all of this. You need 3 decades.
3 decades.
You're going to need about 3 decades. Some people going to need 3 months. You need about 3 decades. And so, I think back on those things now, but they've all shaped me in interesting ways, and I wouldn't trade that experience for anything.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's beautiful. The evolution of who we are.
We keep growing and we keep learning, and I tell people all the time, I have stories and experiences to share because of what I've been through, but I respect that others have the same.
Right. Absolutely. I think a very good place is now, with the women that are speaking their truths.
Oh, amen.
And living, you know, in their authenticity. Like, I know okay, imagine 20 years ago saying, I want to write a book about rural women, and in how that might have been received in certain circles.
How it was received when I told my parents I was going to be a historian?
What did they say?
I would tell anybody. They were not supportive of that.
Oh God!
And not in because they came of age in a certain generation where it's like, you get a job, a stable job, you stay on that job for 30 years. You buy a house, you stay in that house for 30 years. You don't waver, you don't vary, you don't jump from one thing to the next. And you certainly don't do something that isn't understood as being lucrative in some way.
Right.
If you think about what they came from. My mom came from the rural Jim Crow South. My dad grew up in Georgetown, South Carolina, which was urban, relatively speaking, more so than where my mama came from. But there was so much that was uncertain for them that if you got something that even slightly resembles security, you held on to it.
Right.
We don't have to do that as much anymore.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely correct. And
or you join the military, because that was some security as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I find it very interesting to see how I move and how I think about employment, period. Because I was fortunate that I was able to, take a break coming out of the military. I didn't work for 5 years right after I retired. And still now going back into the workforce in the area of human resources is absolutely eye-opening, right? To see how this generation moves when it comes to employment,
right?
And how they value employment. It's not the same.
It's very different, and they value life in ways that we don't.
Right.
Our generation, and certainly my parents' generation, is you worked, and that's who you were. And that's who my late father was, right? You worked for 30 years and you paid your bills and you took care of your family and you didn't think about vacation and things like that. And then one day you're retired. And what do you do with the rest of your life? Because you haven't developed any other interests, any other relationships, or anything like that. We don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to do that anymore. And again, you surely didn't become a historian, because what were you going to do? Teach high school? I ain't never taught nobody to high school.
Right.
but my parents couldn't advise me to become a historian because they didn't know.
They couldn't see it past.
Well, all they knew was what they saw. And they didn't know. But what I knew was that I was stubborn and I was going to do it anyway. And my mother would tell anybody, I'm glad you stuck to your guns.
Right.
Yeah, they didn't know. They simply did not know.
That's beautiful, though, because that's another lesson in that, children can still teach their parents.
Oh, absolutely.
And show their parents, that there is a way to do multiple things, and there are multiple ways to be successful. And, we have to just keep, I think the biggest thing is that you had a belief in yourself, and you had a belief in what it was that you enjoyed.
Right.
And you follow those things that you enjoy doing, you can't go wrong.
Yeah, no, and I knew, my father died back in January. I knew he was proud of me.
Of course.
And I know my mom is proud of me. I asked my mama, I said, Mama, have you read any of my books? No, baby, but I'm real proud of you. And everybody she knows has copies of those. They can't tell me what any of those books are about, but they are proud that they own them and that I wrote them. And that is enough for me.
Yes.
That's enough.
That is what we do.
Yeah. Look at what my baby wrote.
I don't know, but I know it's good.
My baby wrote.
Oh goodness.
And that's when I really began to understand that what I do was never just for me.
No.
It was for the community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It was for the community. And I still operate in that way as a Black woman leader on a predominantly white campus. I tell people all the time, somebody gonna have to come after me. I ain't gonna be here forever.
Right.
So I want to show you what's possible, and then you push the envelope on that, and you show the person after you what's possible even beyond that. And that's how we're supposed to do.
That is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And with that,
yes,
I'm going to say thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. And see, we were fine, weren't we?
Yes, we were.
When is this going to be broadcast, by the way?
I will have to get with Robina and see where it is in the queue. But I don't think it's going to be in time for what you have going on.
Yeah, I'm not worried.
But I do want the information because we can still run it, and that you are an upcoming guest. And this is what you have going on. Check her out here, and then you can see her episode airing so and so.
Yeah, just let me know. Let me know what to do that. Well, I've enjoyed this thoroughly, but while there's still time, I'm gonna run to my favorite store, TJ Maxx.
I heard that.
Yep. But thank you so much for this. It was an honor and a privilege to be here.
Absolutely, for us as well. So thank y'all, Anomalies, and we'll see y'all next time. This episode was brought to you by All Things Poise, Poise Affairs Events, and Tasha. See y'all later.
Take care.